As a thinker, I would like to ask you, who was your inspiration? Whose books were your inspiration when you began your research on language?
My interest in language came through a greater interest in the human mind. I'm not a linguist, I'm a cognitive psychologist, but language is one of the most interesting things that the human mind does. Of the people who've written on language, certainly Noam Chomsky was a big influence, even before I became a cognitive psychologist, when I was a student. And I was also influenced by a book that has no author. When I was a child, my parents subscribed to the Time Life series of science books.
Yeah.
So every month we would get another book in the mail. Sometimes it would be on electricity and magnetism, or on forests, or on the planets. And then one month it was on the mind. And I remember looking through it. It discussed visual illusions, it discussed schizophrenia, discussed IQ, discussed memory, and I thought it was inherently fascinating. The human mind is the most fascinating thing there is, but that book also told me that there could be a science of the human mind, and that was tremendously exciting.
Your first work was on visual
cognition, yes. My PhD thesis was on visual imagery. Mm-hmm. How we close our eyes and imagine a world from memory, how we mentally rotate a scene to imagine what it looks like from different perspectives, how we mentally scan from one location to another, the whole graphic system of the brain.
Yeah, and how did you move from visual cognition to language?
So in graduate school, I developed an interest in both, and I pursued them in parallel. But as my career progressed, I found that I was able to make more original contributions on the language side than on the vision side. And I got feedback from the world when people seemed more interested in what I had to say about language, so I did more and more language, less and less in vision.
You understand language as an instinct, as a faculty of mind that evolved like mine did. In what ways did language evolve?
We don't really know what the intermediate stages of the evolution of language were between an ancestor like a chimpanzee and a modern human. But I believe that language co-evolved with at least two other unusual traits of our species. Mm-hmm. I mean, we are unique in having grammatical language, but we're also unusual in at least two other ways in the animal kingdom. One is that we depend a lot on our own technology. We use tools, we use ways of outsmarting plants and animals. We develop novel ways of gathering our food and protecting ourselves from the elements. So there's technology and know-how, and that's also very unusual in humans. And the third thing that is unusual is that we're very social. We're social not just to our biological relatives, but to people who are not related to each other. And I think those three distinctively human traits, language, knowledge, and social cooperation, evolve together, because each one makes the other two more valuable. If I have language, then you and I can make an agreement. I can promise you to help you in exchange for you helping me in some other way. But we wouldn't even have a conversation unless we were already cooperating enough that we could interact. And if we are solving problems, if we're developing new technologies, that is something that we can talk about. That's a valuable commodity, a valuable object that we can exchange with language, and it makes language that much more valuable.
Does biology, does the cognitive science have an answer to the question, why do humans have language and animals do not?
Well, I think the main answer is that it's part of a complex of human traits that give us a huge advantage, that allow us to, unlike other animals and plants, which are always competing, but they compete over the time scale of evolution. humans can figure things out in our heads. We can play out scenarios. If I dig a hole and if I cover it with leaves, an animal comes by, it will fall in, and then I could go and kill the animal. I can do that in my imagination, and the animal can't evolve a defense quickly enough to defend itself, because I run in cognitive time. How fast I can think, the animal runs in evolutionary time. So I think that combination of knowledge, social cooperation, and language co-evolved in humans because it gives us a huge advantage over other animals and plants. And that's why humans dominate the planet.
I'm very interested in your book, The Blank Slate. And there you make a point to rehabilitate the idea of human nature. Ancients had an idea of human nature, medieval philosophers had an idea of human nature, also modern philosophers, but now in the late times of modernity, human nature, the idea of human nature just was abandoned. Why do you think it's so important to rehabilitate this notion of human nature?
One of them is just to understand who we are. One of the things the ancient Greeks said is, know thyself. And we can't know ourselves unless we know what evolution gave us in terms of our emotions, our desires, our ways of thinking and learning, partly because many of them have built-in flaws and bugs. Unless we know about the irrational parts of our thinking, of the dangerous parts of our emotions, knowing that allows us to try to repress them or work around them. We know our flaws. There was a resistance in the 20th century to the very idea of human nature. It became...
You speak of three main ideas. Very, very interesting. Those three main ideas.
Yes. In my book, I think it was translated as La Tabula Rasa in Spanish, the scraped tablet. Yeah. So the three ideas are the blank slate, the idea that we are born with nothing, and all of the mind comes from parents and culture and socialization and education. The second is the noble savage, an idea associated with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that humans are innately good, or at least don't have any evil, antisocial motives, and that everything that's wrong with us comes from corrupt society. And the third is the ghost in the machine. This was a term from the philosopher Gilbert Ryle as a satire of René Descartes. The idea that we all have a body, we all have a soul, and the soul somehow floats around or inhabits the body. He ridiculed that by calling it the ghost in the machine.
In what ways the idea that our mind, what the ancients call the soul, our mind is not different from our biological constitution, our biological parts, contributes to the new idea of human nature?
Well, yes, we understand that the mind, all our emotions, all our perceptions, all our memories, all our thoughts, consist of the activity of the brain. That there's no ghost in the machine. Yeah. And that the structure of the brain originates from our genetic endowment, our DNA, which then builds a brain that interacts with the environment, that learns, that absorbs information, that allows us to interact with other people, but that it's all information processing in the complex organ, the brain.
I think, I don't know what's your idea, why you call it the secular religion of the intellectual realm. I mean, this idea of the tabula rasa. This comparison with religion is very clear, but also religions have changed in the last decades to approach the actual behaviors of the believers or contemporary times, but this dogma does not move.
Well, I think it moves. I think it moves somewhat. I think there's more appreciation of the effect of genetics, of the fact that our mental life is brain activity.
Yeah.
And even though it remains controversial, even the idea that we have built-in instincts like fear and disgust. Now, some aspects of human nature are still flamingly controversial because people import moral and political lessons to them that I think are illegitimate, are phony, are bogus, dubious, but still people mix the conception of how the mind works with their conception of morality and political ideas. That's why the blank slate became popular in the 20th century. People thought, mistakenly, I think, that it supported important political ideals.
Yeah, I think maybe not just in the intellectual realm, but in popularly, people find it a bit difficult to see themselves, to see ourselves as purely mechanisms.
It's very natural to think of the ghost to the machine is psychologically very appealing. Well, because we all know that when we go to sleep, we close our eyes and we dream, and seems like there's some part of our mind that's walking around in the world while our body is in bed.
Yeah,
and so it's very easy to think, oh, well, the soul leaves the body in sleep. Or in death, a person can be walking around, then all of a sudden looks like they have the same body, but it's no longer animated. And we can think, well, that must mean that the soul has left the body. Even the fact that when we deal with each other, we don't deal with each other just as bodies, as pieces of meat. Each one of us tries to imagine what the other person thinks and wants, and those beliefs and desires don't seem physical. Yeah. They seem like something completely different. So it's natural to think that thoughts and experience occur completely separately from the brain.
Yeah, also not only the difficulty of thinking of it physically, but also mechanically. For example, to fall in love. It's difficult for people to think that falling in love can be also due to a kind of mechanism. It must be some kind of magic.
It's hard to imagine because no human mind can keep track of what happens in 100 billion neurons connected with 100 trillion synapses. We only discovered that there were synapses a little more than a century ago. Yeah. And even knowing just intellectually that the brain is complex, it's hard for me to imagine how patterns of firing in the brain lead to all of my experiences. And so because of that big mental chasm, we think that there is a soul just because it's impossible to understand it mechanically.
What's the role played by language in the functioning of our minds?
Well, language is the way that we acquire much of our knowledge about the world. Most of us didn't discover the existence of Australia or of atoms or evolution. We learn them through language. Our social relationships are negotiated through language. We know whether someone likes us or not by what they say to us. We depend on language as a kind of memory system, because when we attach a sound to a concept, the sound is a way to help us retrieve the concept from memory.
In the blank slate, you say that in the preface that humans, we are more tragic than utopians. Can you develop this idea just a bit?
Well, because human nature is a product of evolution. It wasn't designed to allow us to live in harmony. It has built-in bugs and flaws and limitations. The brain evolved for survival in a Stone Age environment. It emerged from a process of competition, Darwin's process of natural selection. Whichever genes built bodies that had the most offspring are the ones that survive to the present time. Now that means that many of the emotions that we have help us survive and compete, but don't necessarily make us better off, such as the desire for revenge. If someone insults me or hurts me, then I have to harm them. Such as the way that we seek evidence that confirms our beliefs and reject evidence that disconfirms our beliefs. That allows me to win an argument, it improves my status, but it's not a way that we get at the truth. The fact that we fear the kinds of things that were dangerous to our ancestors, like heights, like snakes, like spiders, but we don't fear things that really are dangerous, like texting while driving. So there are many, many cases where the way the mind works is not the way the mind should work if we were to have maximum harmony and happiness. However, even though I defended a tragic vision in The Blank Slate, since then I've become more receptive to the possibility of human progress, largely because I've seen it in data that even though I think humans do have aggressive impulses, rates of homicide have come down over the centuries. Rates of death in warfare have come down over the last 70 years. Humans abolished slavery, abolished despotism. Rates of sexual violence have come down. So there can be improvement. And I think the reason that there can be improvement, even though we're the same primates we were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, evolution doesn't work that quickly.
Maybe humans we are not so Hobbesian. I'm thinking about the influence of Hobbes in your previous vision of humanity, and maybe it's not so Hobbesian.
Well, I do think that Hobbes got a lot of it right, but remember that Hobbes diagnosed us the reason that violence is so common, namely that each of us fears that the other one might attack us, and so we might attack the other before he attacks us. And so you could have two parties or two tribes, each one of which attacks the other out of fear of being attacked first. And even if they figure out how to avoid that, that is, they are strong enough to resist an attack and can retaliate in revenge, it means that if anyone insults you, you've got to attack them to prove that you cannot be exploited. So these are Hobbes's diagnosis for why violence is so common. But he also came up with a solution. He called it the Leviathan. Today we would call it the rule of law. A government that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence and uses it in order to protect people from each other, can reduce rates of violence by penalizing anyone who commits aggression, which also means that I don't have to worry as much about my neighbor, my enemy, because I know that the Leviathan will punish him. So that's just one example of the more general point that even though human nature has aggressive tendencies, we are also cognitive animals. We can think up solutions to problems. We are linguistic animals. We can share our solutions. We can come to an agreement. And we have emotions like empathy, like self-control, that can push back against our more violent impulses and instincts.
One of the very challenging aspects of your research and your clarification of how mind works is that you say that we don't have an ego, a shock. We say in Spanish, there's no ego. There's no. You use a very nice metaphor from Daniel Dennett. There is no sense of looking for the president in the Oval Office of our brain. I mean, there is no ego leading our mind. So ego is a fiction. It's also a fiction, like the slate blank.
Yeah, it's not. I think it is true that there is no one part of the brain that controls everything else. Although there is, I've come to appreciate that the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the front of the brain, not exactly a president in the Oval Office, but still it's the seat of self-control. That it is possible for that part of the brain to repress other parts. And that a lot of human intelligence, human controlled action depends on that part of the brain. We know that because when it is damaged in an accident or a stroke, sometimes the person loses self-control. If there's food, they'll just immediately eat it. If there's a comb, they'll immediately start combing their hair. They don't stop and think, is this appropriate in this situation?
So maybe Plato, who imagined a coachman.
Yes, that's Plato's metaphor of the,
so maybe,
the coachman and the horses. I think there is
the emotions are the black, the bad emotions are the black horse, the white horse are the good emotions. And
I think that there's some reality to that metaphor. Yeah, it's a metaphor.
Yeah, of course.
But some metaphors can be can capture useful, reality. Yes, can be useful.
You wrote a very, very interesting book on style. I mean, you write a lot, and it was very interesting for me to discover that you were so emphatic on the importance of style, because academic or scientific literature is not particularly interested or concentrated on style. Who were your teachers of style?
Well, I had one of my own professors was a social psychologist named Roger Brown.
Yeah.
He also founded the science of child language. In the early 1960s, he was one of the first scientists to study the development of language in children from the age of 2 to the age of 5, when most language is learned. But he was also a gifted writer. He was witty, he was clear, and I learned from him, first of all, just how you can write vividly and clearly and with humor. But also, it taught me that there's a myth that if you write well, you will not succeed in the university, in academia. You have to be obscure, you have to be ponderous. If someone understands you, they'll assume that you're simplistic. The success of his career showed me that that is not true.
And when you're on holidays, what do you like to read? You always read specific literature on mind, on language?
No, not. I like to be exposed to new ideas, and one of the reasons I write books on diverse topics is that it gives me an excuse to read books in areas other than psychology and cognitive science. So when I wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, I got to educate myself in history and political science. When I wrote on writing style, I read many style manuals. For me, that's enjoyable to learn a whole new field that I was not trained in.
Your last book, the last one we know, because it has been just translated in Spanish, is on enlightenment now. I remember that you, in the previous book, you were speaking about the difference between those enlightenment thinkers, which are very proud of reason, who love life, and something like a counter-enlightenment. Could you define this other counter-enlightenment in modernity?
I think historians of ideas often trace the counter-enlightenment to one of the thinkers who's sometimes called an enlightenment thinker, namely Rousseau, who influenced Herder and Schiller, then later Nietzsche, then Heidegger, the existentialists, the postmodernists, the deconstructionists, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and there are different ideas that are mixed together there. But one of them is a skepticism about truth and objectivity and scientific knowledge. The idea that we can't know the truth. There are just mythologies, and no mythology is more accurate than any other. The denial of the individual as the prime unit of society, that whereas the Enlightenment conceived of society as the result of a social contract that was formed by individuals to maximize everyone's happiness and well-being. A romantic view associated with the counter-Enlightenment is that you can't separate a person from their culture, their nation, their race, their tribe, their land, and that it is the well-being of the whole nation that is primary. There's also, whereas the Enlightenment promoted the idea that if we apply human reason to the goal of increasing human happiness and well-being, then we can gradually succeed. There can be progress. Many of the counter-Enlightenment philosophies are deeply skeptical about progress. They believe, in fact, that Western civilization has been deteriorating and will collapse at any time.
The new idea of human nature, in what ways does this idea promote optimism against pessimism?
Well, in the way that at least that I've argued for, human nature is a complex system. It has many parts. There are parts that impel us toward violence and superstition and revenge and exploitation. But there are also parts of human nature that allow us to discover new ways of cooperating, that allow us to feel empathy for other people, that allow us to develop a moral sense, norms about what a decent person should or should not do. And that a lot of human history is a conflict, a contest between the dark parts of human nature and, I use the phrase from Abraham Lincoln, the better angels of our nature, the positive side. And that our institutions, like democracy, like universities, like a free press, like civil organizations, are designed to bring out our better angels and allow us to collectively achieve feats that individually we are unable to do, to make us collectively smarter, more cooperative, more harmonious.
So if you had the chance of meeting a very old TV program, British TV program used to propose, if you had the chance of meeting three great philosophers.
Oh yes.
Which one, I'm sorry, I
yes.
like philosophy.
Yes, no, me
which
too.
Which ones would you choose?
I think Thomas Hobbes, because he not only did he think about violence and how to reduce it, but he also was an early opponent of the ghost in the machine. He believed that the mind was a mechanism, and he is also a great writer, great stylist, often very witty. So he would be great fun. I think Spinoza. And partly it's because he's a member of the family. My wife, Rebecca Goldstein, wrote a book on Spinoza, Betraying Spinoza, it was called. And she identifies him as the man who gave us modernity. He was the one who gave us a secular basis for ethics and morality, a material view of the mind, and he was clearly quite brilliant too. Maybe David Hume, also mind raged over a fantastic number of topics. And then since we're to include women thinkers as well,
of course.
I'd be interested in meeting Mary Astell in the 17th century, who may be the first feminist, who made arguments for the equality of women in a century in which this was almost inconceivable. So what was she thinking? This was before Mary Wollstonecraft, before the modern feminists.
So, well, thank you very much for your time, your patience, and
Thank you very much. Thank you for the conversation.